Now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our host for today's webinar, Lauren DeMar, Global Chief Growth Officer. Lauren, you have the floor.
Thanks, Ellen. And thank you to all the participants who've joined us today. I hope that you and your families, your friends and colleagues are all faring well during this challenging time. I'm actually pretty excited for today's webinar, not only because I've seen the content and it's great, but also because this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I started my career on the client side in brand management, first at Kraft, and then for many years at Unilever. And what we're experiencing now is probably represents the single biggest challenge of a brand owner's career. So today we're going to cover how decision-making and behaviors have changed during the coronavirus and what that means for brands. It's natural for business leaders to be turning their attention to internal priorities right now, things like managing employees, dealing with disrupted supply chains, planning and replanning. The thought of spending and investing in brand development at this time actually might seem scary and risky, when in fact the opposite is true. So we have an excellent session planned for you today with clear guidance on the role that brands should play now and how they should relate to and communicate with consumers. This webinar is part of our ongoing Ask Us Anything series, which means just that. You can ask us anything about the brand and comms topic that we're covering today. Just submit your questions during the webinar. We'll respond to as many as we can get to at the end. And if we don't get to your question during the session, we'll respond via email. So now I'd like to introduce our presenters for today's session. Chris Murphy joined Ipsos this past summer as our Global Head of Market and Brand Strategy. And given our topic for today, I wanted to share one point about Chris's background. On September 11th, 2001, Chris was leading the corporate brand strategy team at Verizon. So he has personal experience with brand management at a time of crisis. Also joining us today as a presenter is Lindsay Franke, Head of Creative Excellence, our advertising practice within Ipsos. During her career, Lindsay has supported and overseen the development of many crisis and disaster response creative campaigns. She's also helped a lot of Fortune 500 companies to reinvent, redefine, relaunch their tone, their positioning, their communication, particularly during times of crisis. She's currently actively helping many different companies identify the most effective way to pivot during and post COVID-19. So without further ado, we'll get started. I'm going to turn the floor over to Chris, our first presenter. And Chris, over to you.
Okay, thanks so much, Lauren. And thanks, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. We greatly appreciate your time. So I'm going to start with a few words about automatic decision-making. So when we perform familiar activities, we're in this cozy little world of certainty with established routines that allow us to simplify our decision-making. And as we learn what works for us or as we master something new, our behavior gets more mindless, more automatic. And lots has been written about, how that plays out in the brand selection world, so I won't bore you with that. But I think it is important to note that, marketing is often designed to drive subtle changes or reinforce or shape those automatic behaviors. And that works pretty well, provided the context and the options available to us are fundamentally stable. But at the moment, I don't think any of us on this phone are feeling anything close to fundamental stability. We have been thrown out of our automatic rhythms. So this graphic that I'm sharing with you now is lifted from a framework that our global science organization has developed to help us understand the drivers of brand selection. And as illustrated here, we are adaptive decision makers. And our behavior is influenced by a range of both contextual and individual factors. So some of these are more external, our physical context, our social context, and some of these are more internal, the way we process stimuli, the motivations or goals we might bring to a given decision, or the abilities, skills, and routines that we might normally employ. But what's happened, with the virus spread that stability has essentially been liquefied. All the physical, social kind of stability we enjoyed before is gone, and we can no longer depend on those sort of automatic behaviors I mentioned before. So when we think about brand management, when we think about brand measurement, we need to do so in terms of shifting context and in terms of behavior change. So, what are brands doing, right, to respond to all this change in context? Well, I think initially, if you go back to late February, early March, it was pretty quiet out there. And I think that there was probably a healthy fear of being potentially viewed as inappropriately opportunistic. And while it's very vital to avoid being perceived as a crisis profiteer, brands really can play an enhanced role in people's lives right now, kind of during this unprecedented kind of period of low-touch context where everything is so fluid and changing. Again, remember, our behaviors, those automatic behaviors, have been disrupted to the point where we're having to deliberate almost every decision or new routine that we adopt, which means people are in a much more active listening mode when it comes to brands. So, again, a critical time for brands to be active, to be engaged. And there's quite a lot we can learn from that last new normal. If we go back a decade to the Great Recession and other recessions for that matter, history shows us quite a lot about brand growth principles in distressing times, and totally understand that the media environment is completely different, now than it was a decade ago. But there is still real strategic wisdom that can be applied from the Great Recession, where we saw brands like Netflix, Lego, Amazon courageously expand. And in the case of a brand like Domino's, just execute just some spectacular transparency in its communications. If you think back to that era, that's when they totally came clean about the deficiencies, right, in their ingredients, and aggressively promoted their commitment to betterment. And so while the competitors of a number of those brands had either stopped communicating or were holding fast to old business models, those brands were pursuing consumers in the right way and delivering value in a period of behavioral change. So, it can seem so tempting and so rational to go into cost containment mode right now. And it sounds very wise to say things like, well, we're going to quietly weather the storm. But the literature suggests that's indeed not the greatest strategy. And we do have a real unique window here where brands can earn trust by being present, by delivering relevant value in this fluid time of high anxiety. So just to be clear, this isn't about profiting from a crisis, right? It's about managing brands and doing business wisely during a crisis. So if we turn our attention to some data here, it's not on this chart, but about 80% of the folks in the U.S. are quite concerned, with the economy right now, and that number is probably even higher than we took when we took that measurement last weekend. But if we look at what is kind of stated here, the majority of folks in the U.S. do expect brands to play a role during the crisis, whether that's in social responsibility, helping them navigate the crisis, or just wanting to continue to hear from brands and what they have to offer. I referenced this a moment ago, but the literature is thick with studies telling us that going dark in recessionary periods is a poor choice. But even so, we see today, like I believe the figure is 55% of UK advertisers have either paused or stopped their campaigns. I suspect that's going to be followed by some regret in the near future. So again, important not to be perceived as a crisis profiteer, but most consumers do understand that the economic wheels must turn. They want them to turn. It's in their interest for them to turn. Another thing for us to consider We are living in a unique era where commercial brand, or people are increasingly open to commercial brands rather than traditional institutions to promote social progress, to promote well-being. And it could well be the case that the current crisis even further accelerates that pattern if brands can rise to the occasion. So we'll take a moment here and look at kind of what that means to rise to the occasion. I think initially it was quite important for brands to step forward and be a source of truth, be a source of positive impact in a world where accurate information can be kind of hard to come by, right? And truly consumer-centric counsel could be a bit hard to come by. So, we've given the example here of the Coke installation in Times Square. I'm guessing many of you have seen this by now, but if you can't read the small text there, it just says staying apart is the best way to stay united, and that's accompanied by kind of that elongated logo treatment there. And again, a very responsible message of truth and positive impact associated with kind of an all-American brand at a central point geographically. In India, we saw brands like Lifebuoy stressing the importance of good hygiene, even to the point where they said, hey, use competitive brands. It's okay. But messages like that in consumer interest were landing quite well in that period. Now, I think we're starting to move into a period where, not that it's not important to continue to show empathy and tell the truth, but now brands are starting to recognize and affirm new social norms, and they're starting to help people build new routines and rituals at home. And this is important because brands can help drive the internalization of new habits by helping us feel good about the way our time is spent. And with many of us adopting a whole raft of new in-home behaviors, building positive associations around those will help us build the motivation to repeat them. And if you look at what Nike's done here, it's fascinating. This particular expression, is dedicated to those, kind of playing in the basement. There is a longer version, of this campaign where the full text reads, "If you've ever dreamed of playing for millions around the world, now is your chance. We may not be playing together. We may not be playing for giant crowds, but today we're playing for 7.8 billion people. This is our chance. Play inside, play for the world," which in a lot of ways brings all of these sentiments kind of together in one place, right? It's empathetic, it's comforting, it's truthful, but it is also simultaneously recognizing and affirming a new set of behaviors that people are adopting. So if we take a step back from this, and we're going to come back to a deeper dive on ritual in just a moment, let's just take a look at the numbers that tell us how people are feeling around the globe. This is a snapshot of kind of how people self-classify into different coping phases right now from a global tracker that we've got in place. The U.S. figures are very similar to this, by the way. But what you can see there, just from a quick look, is that the majority of people are identifying as saying, look, I'm either developing new routines now, or we've kind of settled into some new day-to-day routines, or even some of them are saying we've already started to settle into a new normal. But the point being, you see a lot of people striving for routine, but those new routines don't necessarily equate to comfort. In fact, they don't equate to comfort. I told you a minute ago, 80% of Americans are feeling the economy is under threat. There's also a great deal of concern being expressed for folks who are particularly vulnerable to the virus. There's an impatience to get back to normal life. There is a personal worry about financial security, job security, personal health. So quite a lot of international anxiousness, I would say, around physical and financial health, as well as sort of this need to get back to something that feels more normal. So as people start to figure out this new set of routines while being generally uncomfortable about some combination of health and finance, it is natural for brand leaders to say, okay, help us understand which of those new behaviors are going to be durable over time. And I think we've all noticed we've just been flooded with material speculating about the nature and timing of the new normal. As we address some of that, let's take a quick academic detour and look at how routines can evolve to ritual, because this has real implications for brand strategy in the immediate term. Just defining terms, a routine, it's just a pattern of behavior, right, that's generally performed with very little thought. But a more strictly observed routine can start to become a ritual if it starts to take on meaning. And rituals often emerge in times of uncertainty to allow us to feel a sense of normalcy. Now, you probably see that text in the red box there, labeled, terror management theory. Now, if we titled this webinar Terror Management Theory, God knows nobody would have shown up, so I'll be brief on this. But it's basically saying when we're scared or when we're afraid to die, we start to crave cultural membership. It gives us a sense of self-esteem, and we are more likely to start establishing rituals in those times so that we start to feel some control, start to feel some normalcy. Okay, that's it on terror management, I promise. But rituals also help us fulfill needs. And then with each passing repetition, they get reinforced and they get easier to perform. And again, when they're infused with meaning, they're more likely to stick. So if you want to talk about durability and maybe how to start measuring that, anticipating that, start thinking about need fulfillment, start thinking about meaning, think about ease of performance and repetition. Okay, so kind of building from that, in this new low-touch context, there is a real opportunity to connect brand-associated meaning through either participation in or linkage to the new routines and rituals that are starting to emerge. And just a few kind of procedural thoughts on how brands can start to achieve that. First, we need to identify, which of the new routines could be potentially ritualized and how we go about infusing those behaviors with meaning. Secondly, we need to think about how we can drive internalization of enjoyable new habits that are meeting needs, that are easy to perform, for instance, by helping start to build benefit associations very clearly and linking those to the brand. The next point, we talked about it with Nike before, they can start to illustrate a sense of shared experience. When people are trying something new, they often feel quite alone, and it can feel weird. But if they know that other people are doing it too, well, they're much more likely to repeat it. So this notion of social consensus, building a sense of shared experience, can be very, very important, especially in a period like this. And then finally, now this is true in almost any era, but it is very important that we align the brand experience, that what we say and what we do provide mutual reinforcement. So to kind of recap this, given the nature of rituals and the potential emergence of so many new ones, this is a great and opportune moment for brands to identify potential routines that could be ritualized, to build benefit associations, to affirm these behaviors, to illustrate the social consensus, and then probably most importantly, to clearly align your brand to those meaningful behaviors. So having a quick look at a brand that's clearly on the path to driving ritual behaviors, the craft beer BrewDog has recently set up virtual pubs where people can enjoy online ordered drinks together with their friends. And what they're picking up on here is, one, kind of the fundamental need and desire people have to socialize, drink together. They have opened these virtual pubs in a very meaningful way where they also have musical acts, they have comedy acts. They give people the ability to order drinks through their Hop Drop app. So what they're essentially doing is reinventing the essence of a pub in an online environment. And if you think about that relative to the last slide that we just reviewed, what they're really doing is communicating the normalcy of a shared experience while they showcase their brand's role in facilitating that experience. And BrewDog's been getting lots of positive play in the last couple of months, because you're probably also familiar with a lot of the work they've been doing to provide a lot of hand sanitizer material. So you put that all together, and if you look at the social media data on BrewDog right now, there are just all kinds of positive brand associations, because they are showing up as a positive source of truth and impact. They are recognizing and affirming new social norms, and they're helping people build meaningful new routines at home and linking their brand to it. There are plenty of other brands that have been doing this for years in terms of ritual behaviors. If you look at American Express and Small Business Saturdays, if you think about some repeated performance rituals with powerhouse brands like Oreo, Kit Kat, Stella Artois, those things are very well chronicled. And all those established rituals can be extended into this new low-touch world. But brands that don't have established rituals do have an opportunity now to begin establishing them. So to wrap this bit up, I think people are quite nervous right now. Because their economic concerns are so acute, they do realize that brands have an important role to play in that economic recovery. They expect to hear from brands. They want to hear from brands. So if we then view our current environment through the sort of lens of behavioral science and history, it helps us understand that brands do have a unique opportunity to build and internalize new routines in today's fluid, low-touch context. And if we understand how rituals develop and how routines kind of evolve into rituals, then we have some real insight here into brand strategy, because we're looking for things that are durable, repeatable, and again, associated with brand meaning. So with all of us kind of taken out of our automatic rhythms, with our behaviors completely disrupted, now is the time for brands to become central figures in consumers' lives, in their new rituals. I think it's important for us to stay close to consumers even in this extended period of low-touch context. And I'll say it once again with feeling, they want to hear from you right now.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, and I think what Chris is talking about, that brands want, or consumers want to hear from brands now and really help them get back into their automatic rhythm. And this really is integral when you think about advertising and communicating in a COVID world, and what this means and what we've seen to date in terms of how you can apply what you should do given the circumstances. One thing that, when we talk about communicating and advertising in a COVID world, that we really need to keep at the center and focus is that creativity still matters. And this is something that is unchanged even in a COVID world, that we have to, as brands and advertisers, embody creativity and leverage this as an opportunity to help consumers get back to a state of comfort. Like Chris mentioned, people are in high anxiety right now, and using and leveraging creativity in advertising and communication is a way to really connect with consumers right now. And brands who are shortchanging creativity right now are really losing their advantage and kind of getting lost. And I'll talk about what we see there and how to think about that as you build new communication and messaging in today's environment. But first, one of the things that we want to think about is, given that normalcy isn't in existence right now, and we want to know, how do consumers want brands to make them feel? What role can brands play in communication and helping to ease some of the anxiety and bring consumers back to a state of normalcy, and really, play that role of helping them form new low-touch rituals in a way that helps them feel secure, positive, brings optimism to them. These are things that, when we talk to consumers about what they want brands to communicate and how they want them to feel, a majority of them are centered around this sense of security, stability, normalcy, helping to infuse positivity and optimism, a sense of hopefulness. So when we talk about, we see a lot of brands that, are looking at what role can I play, how do I make sure that I'm not opportunistic in communication. Consumers are really looking to companies and brands to help provide this sense of security and positivity, particularly in this specific situation. This is something that we're monitoring over time to see how this changes, and we're actually seeing, even increased sentiment and intensity of reactions around this need for positivity, normalcy, and stability in society today. One of the other things, though, that while these emotions are key, it's important to make sure that we're not falling into a trap of generic messaging. We know that it's difficult to produce new communication right now, but that reach is stronger than ever. We've got lots of eyeballs on communication and advertising, but there's a lot of sea of sameness going on in terms of messaging and what brands are saying. And it's really, a missed opportunity for many pieces of communication that are not uniquely tied to the brand or delivering something that shows the role that the brand can play in being helpful. And, it's not necessarily surprising that we're seeing a lot of mixed results. Like I mentioned, we see that brands are creating and developing ads in days, not weeks or months. The development cycle is very short. And in fact, when we see results when we're looking at COVID creative, we see some ads that have done it really well, which I'll talk about some of these examples in a little bit, and some that are fighting a challenge of similar messaging and basically getting ignored. So one of the important takeaways is making sure that not only do we continue to infuse creativity into the messaging that we're developing and that creative quality still matters, but also having that distinct, unique voice and that relevant meaning is key. And with some of the shorter production cycles, it's important to not abandon some of the core principles that we know are key in crisis-based communication and advertising. While many of these are basic industry-wide principles, we're seeing a lot of communication divert from ensuring that they deliver credible, authentic, true to the brand messages. And those that are performing the strongest and really having the greatest impact, not only for the brand today, but really for long-term brand building, really deliver in a relevant way and highlight the contribution they're making to the crisis. Now, this could be done in multiple different ways from a contribution, which I'll highlight in a little bit, but really thinking about not only, generic messaging of we're all in it together, but what are you doing to help consumers be in it together? What are you doing as an organization to support this, to help consumers really with their needs, be it from the pandemic to be from economic or even their new lifestyle or social norms that they're facing? So how do we do this and how do we bring this to light? I think, as we saw across our database and 40 years plus of experience, those brands that follow a lot of those principles in fact generate a higher return, and it's something that we want to think about as advertisers and brands. How do we use this to propel our brand into the future? This is not going to be a situation that consumers immediately return back to the old ways. It's not unforgotten. So how do we bring our brands and communicate in a way that shows the role that we have to offer? First and foremost, consumers want brands to take action. So when I'm talking about the important principle and communication of showing your contribution, we see that, consumers really want, when you're communicating with them or talking potentially about the crisis, that you're showing the actions that you're taking. And this can come in a variety of forms. It doesn't just have to be through donation. It can be pandemic related. We've seen lots of brands and companies convert factories in a meaningful way and talk about that with consumers and receive lots of accolades, which is meaningful. But it also can be in ways related to the economic side of the crisis. We're seeing increased sentiment around companies supporting their employees with the rise in unemployment. We believe that this is going to become an even stronger sentiment in the coming months. And also we can even consider taking action more broadly with the new way of living. So, a lot of what Chris was talking about earlier with finding and identifying ways to communicate and show your brand having an integral part of new rituals, new behavior. Many people are stuck at home and have taken on many new roles of being an educator and a professional at once. We see, there's a lot of people that are isolated, and there's an opportunity to take action not only related to the pandemic or the economic crisis, but how people are actually living their everyday. So I think one of the things when we talk to a lot of companies about building their advertising and communication, there's this feeling of paralysis of not understanding what role can we play at a macro level, thinking about the pandemic or the economic side of the crises. But people even just want to hear from brands on how you can help them in simple, everyday challenges they're facing in their new environment and their new world that isn't going to change dramatically overnight, and it's going to be this way for quite a while, even once regulations are lifted. So what does this look like in terms of building communication? There's a couple different things that you can do, which I spoke to around not only providing information, but having that action-oriented, not falling into that sea of sameness of just showing concern or that you're here for consumers. How do you help them? How do you help them with social support? How do you be part of the solution to make the situation better, be it on a macro level or even a micro day-to-day level? And integrating that into communication and advertising is going to be a great way to connect with consumers in a relevant way today. So a lot of times we get questions of who's doing this well, who's doing it right now, and we see particularly that many of the best examples of advertising that was created quickly, again in days, not weeks, not months, really hit on a few key elements. So not only are they pivoting quickly, but we're seeing the best ads are unique, they're creative, and in many cases they're fun, and they have really strong brand integration and hold true to the core tenets or principles of the brand. So while you can pivot and adjust your communication, your strategy, there is still some, core tenets that you can lean on to be seen as authentic and credible and not taking advantage of the situation. So one of the things that we see is, I'll speak to just a couple of these examples quickly, is that all of these have an opportunity and show potential from a metric standpoint for long-term brand building. We see what Domino's has done recently with 2 ads that they've launched. Chris mentioned earlier that they did a great job pivoting, about a decade ago, and we see them doing it again and doing it well and delivering on when I was talking about earlier, consumers desiring that sense of security from communication stability with their contactless delivery, speaking to the temperature the pizza is at, really hitting on within their communication things that help put consumers at ease and comfortable with their communication. Also, as we see that there's that rise in concern of economic challenges and instability, and we know that the restaurant industry has been hit very hard in many cases, that they put together a franchise owner-generated ad, which talked about them hiring right now, particularly in these times of high uncertainty and in their industry. So to help ease concerns and show what they're doing as a company to help those who have been hit financially hard or maybe be out of work due to a lot of the changes that have been happening. Another thing is we get a lot of questions around, can we be funny right now? Is it okay? Is that appropriate? And Hotels.com has done a great job with their communication by leveraging their distinctive assets with Captain Obvious. And it's an industry that a lot of people say, I don't think consumers want to hear from the travel industry right now. They're not going to have any short-term gains from this ad. People aren't traveling anytime soon. But this ad was incredibly well received, very strong in terms of long-term equity building potential. And they leveraged their kind of core tenet of humor and tone of voice that they have had throughout their campaign. So while they pivoted their messaging to align with social distancing and the reality of consumers facing the inability to travel right now, they're investing in long-term brand building. And it's a really great example of bringing lighthearted humor to the situation right now. And we see the same true for non-COVID advertising. We did an analysis looking back at 2008, 2001 with different challenges and crises that our country have faced. And we found that brands that adapted their positioning or pivoted their communication had up to 5 times stronger equity than those who did not evolve or make any changes to their communication or in fact went dark. So you do not have to create COVID-specific messaging right now. So while many brands are doing it, we do see consumer sentiment around wanting aspects of escape, wanting some time for COVID-free advertising, because that's all people hear 24/7. So consumers are giving you permission to advertise outside of the pandemic, but really thinking about still making sure you're speaking to their new lifestyle like Chris was talking about earlier, and how all of us are living, and you get to see us presenting from our homes. So it's a new world for us all. And ultimately, whether it's C-19 specific advertising or just a new pivot or adaptation of your communication, there's many ways that you can build messaging to fit to consumers' need states today, whether it's fighting the boredom or isolation that people are feeling, reinforcing that sense of community, creating new forms of connection where your brand is the conduit for that or the center of being that helpful piece to bring people together, to reassure them or help bring stability back to society. So, I've had several clients ask, is it socially irresponsible to advertise right now? Are we going to be seen taking advantage of the situation? Based on what consumers are telling us, it's almost the opposite, where consumers really are craving for companies and brands to help bring this stability, optimism, and new normal back as quickly as possible. And so leaving you with what we have found to date, it's important to remain active, not sacrifice creativity. Still absolutely important. We know that ads are being made quickly, but there is a need to have unique, distinct voice and do something fun and interesting that's going to capture attention, to not get lost in the sea of sameness, being prepared for fluidity as the situation evolves and being able to adapt and pivot, and really ultimately using this as an opportunity to innovate, not coming out of the crisis the same as you were before, and really using this to become closer and connect even stronger with consumers. And thank you for that, and I will turn it back over to Lauren for some questions.
Yes, thank you, Lindsay, and thank you, Chris. That was great. So we do have some time for Q&A, and we do have some questions that came in. The first one actually is for you, Chris. So when you were introduced, the host, I guess that means me, mentioned your experience at Verizon after 9/11. Anything you can tell us about what Verizon got right or wrong that would apply today?
Yeah, given the introduction, I probably should have mentioned that when I talked, so sorry. I think a few ways to look at that. If I look at it from an insights view, because I noticed a number of folks registered for the call were from the insights community, a couple of things that, especially on September 12th, that I really wanted to know. I wanted to know how behaviors were changing, and I wanted to know how people were feeling, every day, as we kind of adjusted to the crisis and to the recovery. Those are such important things. And then from a communication standpoint, from a brand communication standpoint, I think we did have the good fortune that we were pursuing a positioning in that era of everyday progress, and that really did sort of fit the national mood of recovery at the time, but in an appropriately modest way. And I'm sure most people on the line remember the Verizon wireless campaign, Can You Hear Me Now, that launched in, I think, late January of 2002. And I wish I could take personal credit for that. That wasn't me. That was John Stratton in the wireless group working with Bazell. But I love that campaign. It's still enduring. That modest commitment to betterment not completely unlike what we talked about with Domino's, but acknowledging the imperfections, but the commitment to getting better. And then obviously an experience that kind of matched the claims of staying in touch with consumers, speaking to them in the appropriate way, and then acting, I think as we were speaking.
Thanks, Chris. That's a great case study. There's a question that came in for Lindsay. What do you think is the biggest challenge advertisers face in a COVID world?
Yeah, so I think, great question. There's a lot of challenges right now that I think companies are facing, not only in today, but will probably face in the next 3 to 6 or 12 months. Today, of course, one of the big challenges is the inability to generate new creative, the inability to film right now. We're seeing, of course, there's lots of ways to put together new creative and advertising, whether it be consumer-generated content, user-generated content, and CGI, repurposing of campaigns or footage that exists already. I think the challenge that we're seeing is how to repurpose a lot of that in a meaningful way where it doesn't get lost in the communication that's out there now, and using what you have to pivot to a new message. And I think that is something that can be very challenging to get outside of the box of what your campaigns have been today to change that in a way that's meaningful without new footage. So that's certainly something that can be a big challenge to overcome and make sure that you're not kind of watering down what you're investing in.
Mm-hmm. The next one is for you too, Lindsay, and actually was asked by multiple people. So you mentioned about creativity driving business growth at a factor of 11. So how are you measuring that? How are you defining creativity, and how are you measuring that?
Yeah. So the piece that I mentioned at the beginning is actually a lot of industry factors that have shown impact on sales growth and market share, evaluated by many companies like within the industry, looking at even our partnership with the Effies and Effective Advertising. For creativity specifically, of how we are assessing strong creativity and what we're looking at and partnering with our clients, we have lots of different dimensions in terms of what's the emotional response that it's evoking among viewers. Is the creative unique? Does it stand out? The principles for creativity can look different depending on what the industry is and what the messaging is and the intent. What we're also looking at for long-term impact is sentiment to brand. So we've got a predictive model to look at brand potential and impact on long-term equity, which also ties into our tracking that we do across the organization to say how much potential does creative have to have a long-term impact. So not only looking at those short-term measures, because for a lot of crisis advertising specifically, it doesn't make sense to look at short-term measures. Domino's maybe is an exception, but most brands are really looking at the long-term equity builds. That's something that we look at and measure for potential and what are kind of the drivers behind that.
Thanks, Lindsay. There's been another one for you too. But before I go there is one for Chris. So Chris, in the post-pandemic world, and we can't get there soon enough, which consumer behaviors do you think will have the most lasting change?
Oh, wow. Okay. All right. A word on measurement and a word on speculation. How's that? So a lot of people are asking that question, of course.
Yeah.
And I think we're putting some measurements in place to get at some of those themes that I talked about a little bit earlier around enjoyability, ease of replication, does it have meaning, those types of things. Because I think that starts to help us build a quantitative foundation for the speculation. Now, from what I have seen so far, and this is where I'm going into full-on speculation mode, so this might sound stupid 3 months from now, but I think a lot of what's going on in e-commerce very likely to stick. I think some of what's going on in maintaining or kindling distance relationships could very well stick. This notion of shared viewing amongst family members, you're starting to see a lot of that cocooning and kind of shared intake go on again. A lot of families are probably recognizing, oh, that's quite healthy. It's something we'd like to continue. I think more strict hygiene is likely to continue for an elongated period, right? And probably even past the point where we have a cure. And this is a strange one, but it's coming from a Tennessean. Lawn care. I think I'm noticing that in this period, I've never seen so many immaculately maintained lawns in my life. But I think a lot of people take pride in it, and of course the same thing goes on for inside the home, but I think as people feel kind of the reward of those accomplishments, whether it's in-home or outside, we'll see some of that stick. I'm sure there are plenty of more, but I'll stop there.
Maybe some of the self-care behaviors around eating better, exercising more, all of that. Could be some other ones as well. So thank you, Chris. So I know we're a little bit over the time. There's still a number of participants here. I maybe throw another last question out to you, Lindsay. So you talked about ads that are getting it right now. Some brands. In terms of how they're advertising, communicating for Domino'sHotel.com. I think Patagonia was on the list as well. How is Ipsos assessing the success of those ads? How did you come to that conclusion?
Yeah. So we've actually, we have a solution that we've been using to evaluate creative on a number of dimensions that really are focused around what crisis advertising is looking to deliver on. And we've run these through we're calling it our rapid response solution to look at any opportunities for refinement and reactions and then impact on long-term equity. So when we look at the dimensions, we're looking at unique brand connection. So is the ad seen as unique? Does it have a distinct message, voice? Is it entertaining and enjoyable? We're also capturing unstated emotional reactions to understand how people are responding from an unstated manner. Also, like I mentioned, that long-term equity measure, we're looking at that, our brand effect index to see how likely these are to have an impact on long-term brand connection, relevancy, sentiment, and performance. And a number of other diagnostics to see what we think is going to connect, and is it going to improve saliency for the brand as well as kind of that long-term connection.
Perfect. Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you, Chris. So we do have some other questions, and we'll respond to those after the webinar via email. That's all we have time for today. We are a bit over time, so I want to just once again thank you all for joining us, and a big thank you to Chris and Lindsay for their preparation and for their time. Take care, everyone.
All right, thank you. Thanks, everybody. Bye. Have a nice day.